Welcome to MintPress News. I'm Catherine Shagdam, MintPress Middle East correspondent. I am joined today by Lia Tarachansky. Lia is a filmmaker and the Israel and Palestine correspondent for the Real News Network, where she produces short documentary-style reports exploring the context behind the news. In 2013, Lia completed work on her first feature documentary, On the Side of the Road, a narrative productions film. And the film is an exploration of the power of denial. It questions what Israelis learn, know, and sometimes choose not to know about the 1948 war. And I have to say that I found Lia's documentary to be absolutely groundbreaking. Not only does it challenge Israel's narrative vis-à-vis Palestinian, but it actually delves into the very essence of what it means to be Jewish in Israel and to be an Israeli. So Lia, thank you so much for being here today. I'd like first to talk about why your documentary spoke to me and why I believe it actually concerns us all. Looking at world events and how violence and sectarianism have defined how we relate to one another as people and communities, it is quite clear to me that something needs to change. And I'm not only talking about Israel and Palestine, but globally. And I said this to you before, and I'm going to say it again. I believe that until we learn to not define ourselves through our hatreds and our prejudices, we will rob ourselves of a real future. So you talk about identity and how Israelis have in many ways became prisoners of their own self-imposed labels. So can you tell us more about that?
Sure. What we call Zionism, is like all nationalisms, a constructed, invented identity. For us, Jewish people have lived as minority groups all over the world for most of our existence. If you follow the biblical story, about 6,000 years, and we have been living everywhere with everyone and in different kinds of successes, and of course we know about, So then all of a sudden, within the course of a couple of decades, to be sort of forced into this one piece of land, this one kind of legitimate nationalism that made itself the only legitimate nationalism. Of course, it created a ton of frictions and conflicts and beautiful cultural eruptions. And as we all know, it came at the expense of the Palestinians. So Israel, I don't know if you know, but Israel, the majority of Israeli Jews are actually not Europeans anymore. The majority are Jews from the Arab world, from North Africa, from Iran, Iraq. Jews that grew up in the Middle East until the creation of Israel, until the 40s, more or less, have never really experienced anti-Semitism the way my family and other European Jews did in Europe. And you put them together along with a European Jewry that is deeply, profoundly traumatized as a result of what they've been through over a few centuries in Europe. And you create this kind of like schism between the story that you tell people and the reality that you live. And of course, over the 67 years, Israel has become a major military power. It's one of the top nuclear powers in the world. It's definitely the hegemony in the region. And so you have this double identity in Israel that has to coexist together. The identity of the strong, the overpowering, wars are inevitable, the army is what unites us, and we, and Israeli identity by and large, revolving around this military image, at the same time as you have profoundly traumatized, trauma that has never really been processed. We talk about what happened in the Holocaust, but we rarely talk about the impact of that trauma on generations. And of course, trauma, as I'm sure you know, is not an event that happens in time. It is the way in which it intertwines itself into your very psychology. And it has intertwined because it was an attack on the nation of the Jews, on the Jews everywhere. It has had an impact on the nation of the Jews. I as someone who's never been through the Holocaust, has only lived through Soviet anti-Semitism, and only for very briefly when I was a little kid, and deeply, profoundly aware of the family trauma of having lost most of our members in the Holocaust. My grandparents growing up with Soviet anti-Semitism, and of course my father, he lived through the Nazi siege on St. Petersburg. All these things together become a major part of your identity. On the national scale, multiply that by 7 million, and you have the State of Israel. So it's a complex society, and it was formed by, Zionism was formed by people who subscribe to European colonial ideals. So into this complex mix comes in the political colonialism that Israel has been benefiting from, and of course perpetrating all over Palestine. So, and the Palestinians, our relationship with the Palestinians adds a lot to that identity, because, of course, if we are the victim, how can they be the victim of victims? And I think this is the first thing that you encounter with Israelis when you start talking about the occupation, the Nakba, and the impact of living in an ethnocratic regime where you have two sets of legal rights for citizens inside Israel, for Palestinian citizens and for Jewish citizens. The first thing you encounter with Israelis is this denial, which of course is the topic of my films, but it's the denial is the first step of it is the frontal, basic, first sort of guarding denial, which says, no, it's not true. And anyway, if it's true, I'm the real victim, not them. And once you start digging through that, and I think that this is the layer, the deepest that the media gets is this layer. But underneath it are an infinite spiral of layers. And I think that as a society, by and large, we are evolving. We are actually moving through some kind of progression when it comes to that denial. That first frontal sort of barrier, I think, was true by and large in the 80s, when all that information was coming out and Israeli historians were digging up all these things. Today we're in a different place where most Israelis no longer deny that the fact that the destruction happened, that the hundreds of villages were destroyed, that 2/3 of the Palestinians were expelled, that everything was renamed, remodeled, redone. But we deny the moral implications of it. So we are still in this kind of really sort of dichotomy of looking at it from the one perspective. Of course, it's an enormous national trauma, but we made the land better, we made the land more fertile, we made the land more modern, and so on. And anyway, they're not really attached to the land, and anyway, it's the Arab countries' fault for not giving them citizenships, and anyway. And as this socialist Stanley Cohen writes, this is a necessary step in the progression of denial. And in fact, he labels it as the last step, because as the Chinese proverb goes, to know and not to act is not to know. So the next step is internalizing the moral implication of what we've done to the Palestinians, and what is our responsibility in that sense, and what that will mean for our changing identity. And I think that in Israel, if anything is true today, people are tired. They're tired of on both sides. They're tired of the narrative. They're tired of the justifications. They're tired of the constant fighting. They're tired of this rhythm of war and destruction and losing members of family and friends and
as are the Palestinians.
Tired of it all, as are the Palestinians, and they think the young generation is tired also of dogma and nationalist movements and excuses.
Maybe it means that we don't have a strong revolutionary
maybe it means that we don't have a strong revolutionary movement anymore. We don't have a strong ideological movement anymore. But I would argue that it's actually...
when people are tired of fighting, they find a way to live together.
Because when people are tired of fighting, they find a way to live together.
That actually leads me to my second question, because I was actually wondering, the way we perceive ourselves and define ourselves is, ultimately translates in how we relate to other people and how we see other people. And in your documentary, you talk a lot about how Israel, the Israel social and ethnic map, and how communities have walled themselves in, as you said, within the state of Israel. So I was wondering, how much of this do you think has translated into the way Israeli position themselves against Palestinians? Is it that, the hatred and the fear of Palestine, is it like, to which level is it a drive or a factor to Israeli identity? Because very much I feel sometimes that Israelis are defined by their hatred towards Palestinians, but we could actually argue that it is actually this fear that is defining them, that rather than reacting to it, they are becoming it. What do you think? What do you make of this? Because this is, I'm talking as an observer, and how I'm kind of looking at the dynamic of that conflict, and I really believe that there are two sides to this, and it takes really two people to engage into either a fight or a conversation, and therefore I feel that people are kind of feeding off each other, but to a point where it has become so big that they have become the very thing that they hate in a way, because they have let themselves be defined by fear and absolute hatred. Because I don't think there's even a logic to this kind of hatred. I mean, on both sides. I mean, you hear horrible statements. Dehumanization, where people do not become people anymore, but are just things, or they are just political factions or ideas, and they stop being humans to a point. So, how much of that is playing into Israel's psyche? Because I really feel like you said that there's a change that is occurring now in Israel, where people are really asking themselves question, and they are trying to challenge what the state should be.
Yeah. Well, he said a lot there.
Yeah.
It's a lot of different.
Well, he said a lot there. It's a lot of different things that I think it's profound. I mean, I often ask myself the question: why are people so interested in Israel-Palestine? I think it's the most over-covered conflict in the history of conflicts. And as a journalist who covers the conflict for an international English-speaking audience, I have to ask myself why I feel it's so important for me to tell our story.
I think Israel, in a way, is a fascinating and tragic story.
In a way, is a fascinating and tragic story for many people. I think it's a story of.
I think it's the story of humanity.
I think it's the story of humanity.
We should have done better.
We should have known better.
Been better.
We should have done better.
But we weren't.
We should have been
like
better.
Else.
But we weren't. We were just like everyone else.
And I think that it's a profound lesson.
And I think that it's a profound lesson
to all humanity.
To all of us in the world. To all humanity.
Inherit trauma.
That when you inherit trauma,
unprocessed trauma.
I mean, the only exception is that I don't know of any other example except for maybe the Second Reich in Namibia, where there was a destruction and on the level that the Jews experienced. Of course, the indigenous people in North America and South America. But I mean, it was done with a malicious intent to destroy and eliminate and eradicate. So I think it is an exceptional tragedy.
When you don't process that tragedy, when you don't really process that trauma,
when you don't process that tragedy, when you don't really process that trauma, the world moves forward, and you are now in a war, and you now have to decide: am I going to expel this village, or potentially lose the possibility of having a national homeland?
You don't process it, and you inherit it.
In the end, you don't process it, and you inherit it, and it goes generation to generation to generation, and it creates a paranoid society that is based on fear. And
the Minister of
immigrated to Israel. I was 6 years old, and the Minister of Immigration. Ministry of Immigration. In Israel, they're called Ministry of Absorption.
To Israel unless you're a Jew.
Policy.
So
you can't immigrate to Israel unless you're a Jew.
At the airport,
so they came to welcome us at the airport, and I remember it was just in the middle of the first Intifada.
With asked, what is this? You in the war? What's happening?
frustrated with, asked, what is this? You know, are you in the war? What's happening? And the minister said, you know how you were hated in the Soviet Union for being Jews? Well, now these people hate you. And if you want to be free, now in Israel, you have the chance to fight back. And I think that really summarizes it all. And the fear and the rage and the terror imposed upon the Jews in Europe was completely transferred to the Palestinians. And from the very beginning, you know, it's not. This was the event that defined the creation of Israel. So it is, of course, the central biggest thing of Israelis. Having said that, I don't think that most Israelis hate Palestinians. The idea that they have about who Palestinians are, because, of course, the only thing we ever learn, it comes in the form of conflict. You know, the Israeli academic Norit Peled-Elhanan, who is the sister of Miko Peled, you may have heard of him. He wrote
is a brilliant academic in her own right, and has written, you know,
is a brilliant academic in her own right, and has written, you know, a ton of books about the Israeli education system. And her daughter was killed in a suicide bombing when she was 13, so she had double the motivation to try and understand what is it that drives this whole thing. And in one of her books, she goes through all the Israeli textbooks to find out how Palestinians are portrayed. And she finds that, with the exception of 2 or 3 images, the images that are portrayed in Israeli textbooks are either of primitive Bedouin people on camels in the desert, Palestinians throwing stones wearing kufiyas, so very intimidating image for Israelis, or and that's it. So you don't, and most Israelis, despite the fact that we live inside the Middle East, we, you know, Palestinians make up half the population from the river to the sea, and despite very intentional and aggressive policy of segregation, both inside Israel and in the West Bank in Gaza, most Israelis live within a kilometer of Palestinians. So how can it be that you have such a skewed image? Why do you, like, when the average Israelis think about Palestinians, they think about conflict. They don't think about a family going to do groceries and to the kindergarten. They don't think about Palestinian life. They don't think about Arabic language. They don't think about poetry. They don't think about the profound contribution that Palestinians and Arabic people in general have made to the world. They think of primitivism and terrorism and so on. And so, in that context, of course they're afraid of it. Why wouldn't they be? And the propaganda perpetrates itself, generation to generation. The oldest generation didn't talk about what they did in 48, didn't talk about the massive destruction of Palestinian society, of the Palestinian elite, of the Palestinian cities, of Jaffa, of Haifa, of the economy. They don't talk about these things, of course, because they perpetrated them. The next generation didn't know, and they grew up in the 67 war and 73 war. And the young generation grew up with Intifada. So what could be expected of them to know? So I think that's why we have such a responsibility as Israelis to tackle first and foremost Israeli society and not fear. And so that's why in my film, I just wanted to show like a regular, it profiles Israelis. It's not a film that is,
just the Palestinian character there is in my film. I don't explain him.
The Palestinian character there is in my film. I don't explain him.
This is true of Khalil. He just is.
This is true of the Palestinians. This is true of Khalil. He just is. Because, of course, once you break through those barriers, you realize that people just are. They just exist. They just people. They just want regular.
To raise and to build futures and
to raise and to build futures and to dream forward. So I think that the fear that we have wrapped ourselves in is I know that it's probably a controversial statement, but I think it makes us victims, and it robs us of a better future. I think it robs us of getting to know each other, and I think it robs us for me, as someone who found a way to overcome that fear and lived with Palestinians, whether I live in Jaffa or in the West Bank, I've learned so much. I've been enriched so much of understanding the Arabic language and of understanding Palestinians and learning about them and their culture and their history. It's made my life in the Middle East so much more meaningful. And I think that once Israel stops exceptionalizing itself and pretending it's in Europe, and once the Arab states open the borders as well, I think we could have a much better future. But as I'm sure you know, global politics doesn't work on hope, and governments don't hope to steal land, they just do. And we, much of what we do is a drop in a bucket that doesn't have any impact on the grand scheme of things. But this is what we are, and this is what we have to continue doing, whether or not it's effective. And I hope that to someday live in an Israel that is not fear-based.
Blindness and how a lot of Israelis have become blind to Palestinians, full stop. Not just to their pain, but just to their very existence. You have come back from that because you were living in a settlement, I believe, and yet you really came back and now you see. How did you do that? How did you manage to kind of, I would say, break free, because you really freed yourself from everything that people told you you should be, to just become who you wanted to be. So how do you think people could translate what you've done, and just do and free themselves?
Well, I mean, there's no formula.
There's no formula.
When I was 16, my mom took us to Canada.
I had the privilege of, when I was 16, my mom took us to Canada. So I had the privilege of having lived outside for a good chunk of the formative years. And I became very politicized already outside of Israel, Palestine. And I met Palestinians. Meeting Palestinians for the first time in the diaspora was huge. Growing up in a settlement is you don't see it.
By the time I moved back to Israel, I was already very political and was very much critical.
So by the time I moved back to Israel, I was already very political and was very much critical, but I hadn't lived it yet. I had already changed my mind, but I haven't lived. When I first went to the West Bank to visit my friends and Palestinians there, I was
thinking about what it would be like to be in the West Bank.
And I was thinking about what it would be like to be in the West Bank for the first time now as someone different, as someone else. So as the bus was driving, I was looking out the window, and I realized there was all these villages along the way, and I had no recollection of them being there. In my mind, you go to the West Bank, and it's a black hole. There's a road. I had memory of the road. You get to the circle. I had memory of the circle. You take a right, and it's Ariel, and everything else is just a black hole. And so, for the first time, my mind started filling in the black hole. So I think that it's a combination of living it. It's a combination of education and getting to know people, and being in a safe enough space that you can meet them, that you can see them, that you can interact with them in a way so that your mind can open to that education.
So it's a very violent process, it's a very long process, it's a very painful process. And you don't feel like you're gaining anything. It's all painful. It's all pain every step of the way. And unless you're very motivated to go through that process, there's very little chance that you will. Especially while you're in an active conflict, you are in an active occupation, and you are sending your kids to fight and be soldiers and occupy and take and kill and so on. There's very little motivation that you will do that. And that's why I don't think that it's reasonable to expect Israelis to do that. As the Israeli activist Jeff Halper says, systems of oppression don't evolve into something better. They become unsustainable and collapse. And we see now that in Israel, that we are in the unsustainable stage. And we're very aware that we're in the unsustainable stage, and we're very afraid of what that means. And I don't think it takes an expert to see that the collapse is not far off. And so sooner or later, we will be forced to go through that. I hope that it will be within a framework of conflict resolution, transformation, and truth commissions, reconciliation, dealing with collective denial, dealing with collective trauma in the way that the world now knows to do. Maybe not very well, but knows. Rather than what is much more likely, which will be a collapse and destruction and civil war and so on. So that's what I'm digging towards. That's what I'm hoping for, and that's what I hope to lay the ground for when that happens. But there's no formula for how to be different, and I think it's a combination of a lot of luck.
Really done it. This is, you actually touched upon something that I wanted to talk about, which is, the military. Because, more and more people now are actually, either leaving the military or refusing to serve the military in Israel. And, if I'm correct, both men and women have to serve.
That's right.
Unless there's, the exempt, because there's only very, specific instances. So there is a shift now that is actually happening in Israel, where Israelis are almost, I think, rethinking the state, in that the state of Israel, was created in war, and has been in a state of war ever since. You are still in a state of emergency, and you always are war with something. It's just, it's just this perpetual, fear and threat that is, hanging over all your heads. So do you think that it is the kind of conversation where the Israelis are saying no to the military because they are tired of war, or because they understand that by saying no to the military they are forcing, the political class to kind of rethink, the makeup, I would say, of the state, because then the military will become almost irrelevant, because right now it is really the main axis of the state, and it's almost controlling every aspect of your life. Because, so do you think that it is just like no to war, that people are just tired and have had enough? Or is it that they really want to kind of like rethink the entire state of Israel altogether, and maybe try to, to find a solution? Because they've been told so far that it's either this, or, the Arab nations will basically befall them and destroy them, which I think is very simplistic. And I don't think that would actually happen, because, it might have been true back in 1948, but, it is not true anymore. There is a state now. No one can deny that.
Well, many people do.
I know, but again, this is I think it's political, because I don't think that people, you cannot deny reality, and I think it would be wrong to just tell people to back up and leave just because, the way they came was maybe wrongly framed. But now realities are that those communities are there, and they have as much right to be there than the people that were there before them, because they're there. And that's something that we have to deal with. We can't stay in that cycle of violence and finger pointing and saying, well, I have more rights to be here than you are, because for me, they're there. So let's deal with that reality and see how we can live together, rather than just keep fighting each other.
Right.
But going back to the military, what kind of a conversation the Israelis are having with the state right now?
For example, the Israeli Democracy Institute, the IDI, they do polls every year, and especially around election time. And so asking Israelis what they think about various state institutions. And so you have the parliament, you have various parties, you have the Supreme Court, which is now a prominent actor in the Israeli attempt to become a democratic state, and you have the army, and of course many other institutions. And the approval rate of the government and the Supreme Court, Parliament, it tends to be fairly low, 30-40%. The army, almost 90% every time. And in fact, I think that Israelis are such a segregated society amongst the Jews. You have the Russian Israelis, you have the Ashkenazi Israelis, you have the Mizrahim, that come from the Arab world in North Africa, you have the Ethiopian Jews, you have the rich, you have the poor, very small middle class, and you have an incredibly privatized, centralized economy where about 18 families control 70% of the economy. So there's the sense that you're broke. In Israel, there's no social mobility. If you're born poor, you will die poor. So there's no hope for the future because you can't come out of this reality of poverty. Most of the people are poor. Many people are living in third world conditions. The majority of the poor, of course, are the Mizrahi Jews, the Jews from the Arab world, North Africa. And the political situation is hopeless, the way that it looks like from the ground. So the general sense, and also politics in Israel is, when you look at what the Israeli press covers day to day, the majority of it is corruption scandals. Every institution in Israel is deeply corrupt. Every other day we have news of a different mayor who embezzling money. And Israelis' general attitude towards their politicians is one of distrust. It's assumed that they are corrupt. Every major minister in the parliament is associated with some kind of corruption scandal or sex scandal or something else. So the army is pure in the mind of Israelis, not in the sense that it is a revolving door with the arms industry, and that arms industry fuels the Israeli economy, and without it Israel might collapse economically. Israelis are almost entirely blind to that, and it's not by accident. I go to many of the war conferences that happen every 2-3 months, the drone arms conference, the ground forces arms conference, and so on. And I don't see journalists there. They just don't go. They don't come. They don't cover that. They don't cover the industry. And it's, of course, the biggest industry. It's the defining industry of Israel. What Israelis see is the ground army. They see their brothers fighting. It's the only democratic institution for Jews in Israel, because no matter what family you come from, more or less, you are in the same trench, in the same shit, digging through, training and sweating and fighting and having each other's backs. And so there's this whole mythology around the army of being the place where we are equal, of being the necessary step, and criticizing the army, or rather criticizing Israeli policy becomes criticizing the army, and that's why Israelis are so rejecting of it. So if you approach Israelis not from a place of criticizing the army, if you put that aside for a minute and you divorce that from Israeli policy, you have a very honest conversation and you can actually make a lot of headway. But if you criticize the Israeli army, the door's shut. Because of course everybody's fighting in the army, men and women. And yeah, we have, now a movement of people that refuse, but every year it's no more than a dozen individuals. It's not a massive movement of people refusing to serve. The Orthodox are the biggest group that don't serve, and they don't serve because they are religious, so they're by and large pacifist, and also they're not Zionist. They don't believe in fighting in the army for the Zionist state because they believe that the Messiah must come before that state can exist. So you have the Palestinian citizens of Israel that don't serve, the Orthodox that don't serve,
Many of the women don't serve. If you in the army, if you get pregnant or if you get married, you don't serve, and so on. So if you take together all the army, the majority, and yet you have this image that everybody serves, everyone's together in this, and to not serve in the army is shirking your responsibility to your society.